All right, I have 2 minutes after 12 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started. This webinar is being recorded and people will be able to jump on as they can. If you have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A feature at the very bottom. And we will answer any questions that I'm able to answer as we go, and then I'll save the rest for Dr. Chambers for near the end of the program. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for episode 2 of For Our River Educational Webinar Series. My name is Emily Floor. I'm the Executive Director for St. Mary's Riverkeeper. In today's webinar, we are joined to learn by Dr. Lisa Chambers to learn about the value that wetlands play in combating climate change through carbon sequestration. This is the second webinar of the series to address and hopefully answer some of the complex issues and questions you may have about the proposed mining project on the edge of our St. Mary's River doorstep and the Okefenokee Swamp. Each episode will focus on a specific topic with a different subject matter expert and allow time for discussion from our participants to help us understand better each topic. You can find last week's episode webinar recording on our website under Advocacy Webinars. So today we are joined by Dr. Lisa Chambers from the Biology and National Center for Integrated Coastal Research from the University of Central Florida, and we will delve into the role of wetlands play in carbon capturing. But before we get to that, we're going to discuss St. Mary's Riverkeeper's work to protect the St. Mary's River, our efforts to monitor and educate the public about the health of our river, and ways you can engage today. And then we will hear from our guest speaker and end with Q&A from you. So who we are. To begin, let's talk about St. Mary's Riverkeeper to discuss who we are and what we do to ensure our river is protected. Founded in 2016, St. Mary's Riverkeeper is an independent voice for the St. Mary's River, dedicated to improving water quality in areas that are designated as swimmable and fishable, ensuring the river thrives for future generations with our work in resiliency projects and community partnerships, promoting low-impact development in a fast-growing area, finding solutions for water-related issues within the watershed, and advocating against industrial threats in our underserved communities. Our priorities: as a trusted voice for the St. Mary's River, Riverkeeper fulfills its mission by investigating pollution problems and seeking solutions to protect the St. Mary's River, ensuring environmental regulations are implemented and enforced, advocating for the protection of our river and participating in decision-making process that represents the interest of our river, our members, and the public, educating the public about the St. Mary's River and the issues impacting its health, providing frequent opportunities for people to experience and serve their river through boat rides, field trips, and river cleanups, and engaging with citizens to effectively resolve problems impacting the river and their neighborhoods and community. As a border river, the St. Mary's River watershed is comprised of 4 counties, 2 in Georgia and 2 in Florida, with roughly 60,000 residents who depend on the health of the river for tourism, recreation, commercial fishing, and safe drinking water. Arising from the Okefenokee Swamp, the St. Mary's River flows 130 miles to the Atlantic Ocean at Cumberland Island National Seashore. The watershed has more than 3,000 miles of streams and tributaries, is comprised of 40% wetlands, and is home to many endangered and threatened species such as the Atlantic and short-nosed sturgeon. The shape of the St. Mary's River is defined by the natural break and trail ridge. The Okefenokee Swamp and the upper section of the St. Mary's River runs along the western side of Trail Ridge. The river then turns eastward for about 15 miles as it makes its way through the gap in Trail Ridge. And then the river heads north for about 30 miles, running along the eastern side of Trail Ridge before turning east at the Hilliard-Folkston area to head out into the Atlantic Ocean. The southeastern corner, about 20% of the swamp, feeds the St. Mary's River, which results in the upper river having zero flow at times and flooding at others. From swamp to sea, the St. Mary's River is pristine. The land along the St. Mary's River is almost entirely private owned by timber plantations, conservation districts, and private citizens. In 2022, Georgia DNR declared 2 segments of the St. Mary's River safe for recreational use: Deep Creek to Boone Creek and Prospect Landing to the Little St. Mary's. So what sets us apart? We have an extensive water quality monitoring program. We have over 50 sites we monitor regularly throughout the watershed for chemical parameters such as dissolved oxygen, pH, turbidity, salinity, conductivity, and bacterial parameters such as E. coli. We have river cleanups. We do experiential learning opportunities through paddle trips, bike rides, birding opportunities, and boat trips. Our river enhancement projects are living shoreline at Fernandina Beach to help with sea level rise, climate change, resiliency, and to reduce the energy from the big boats that come through. And then our advocacy and engagement opportunities. Some of our upcoming events, we have our St. Mary's River Cleanup. This is a watershed-wide event. All 4 counties engage at over 25 sites throughout the watershed to clean up. And last year, we picked up 8 tons of trash out of the St. Mary's River along the shorelines and the main stem itself. We have our boat tours. We have 2 scheduled. One is this Saturday, leaving from Folkston, Georgia at Traders Hill Boat Ramp. We only have 6 spots left on that one. And unfortunately, or fortunately, our one next week is already sold out. Our next Lunch and Learn is next Wednesday, March 8th. We will be talking about the Floridan aquifer, soils, and water withdrawal with Dr. Jeremy Stalker from Jacksonville University. And then currently the most immediate way to engage is through the mining public comment, which is why we are here today. And all of this information can be found on our website, www.stmarysriverkeeper.org. So we're going to talk a little bit, give a little bit of background before we get started. So our headwaters, the St. Mary's River headwaters, is the Okefenokee Swamp. And this swamp is around 438,000 acre blackwater swamp, the largest in North America, and is designated a wetland of international importance. The swamp is the headwaters for both the St. Mary's River and the Suwannee River, which provides clean water to these pristine waterways. The Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge protects 93% of the wetlands that comprise the Okefenokee Swamp, and it sees over 600,000 visits annually, with 10% of the visitations represented by international guests from over 46 countries. From 2017 to 2021, the average annual expenditures associated with recreational visitors to the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge and its partners around the swamp totaled $39.2 million. The swamp has shaped the culture of Southeast Georgia. Most residents in the Tri-County area around the swamp have ancestors who once lived or worked in the swamp as part of their heritage. So now the question is, what's being mined? Twin Pines Minerals is an Alabama-based company looking to mine along the crest of Trail Ridge, as you can see pointed in the red, circled in the red, with a hydrologic divide running through the mine site. Ironically, both sides of the ridge flow to the St. Mary's River. The west side flows to River Styx, which is a tributary to the swamp, which then flows out into the St. Mary's River. And the east side flows to Boone Creek, a tributary to the main stem of St. Mary's River. A new federal regulation called the Navigable Waters Protection Rule went into effect in 2020. The rule changed the way wetlands are defined by the Clean Water Act. So the federal permits and environmental impact statements no longer were needed before building certain waterways. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers ruled that because of this change, it lacked jurisdiction over 376 acres of land within the proposed mine site. So Twin Pines can proceed if Georgia EPD approves the permits. Parts of the refuge's Trail Ridge is rich in titanium-bearing ore such as ilmenite and other heavy minerals. In the past, attempts to mine there have failed due to concerns about the Okefenokee. Titanium is a strong, lightweight mineral used to build everything from missiles and jet planes to orthopedics and consumer electronics. This mine will mine for ore to process into titanium dioxide to make pigments that whiten cosmetics, paint, and other consumer products. So now we're going to welcome Dr. Lisa Chambers. I'm going to introduce her, and then I will turn it over to her slides. Dr. Lisa Chambers, Associate Professor in Biology and National Center of Integrated Coastal Research at University of Central Florida. She focuses on the impacts of disturbance such as sea level rise, climate change, and urbanization on wetland and coastal ecosystems functions, including nutrient cycling, greenhouse gas production, and carbon storage. She is principal investigator for UCF's Aquatic Biogeochemistry Lab, and she holds a PhD in soil and water science from University of Florida, an MS in oceanography and coastal sciences from Louisiana State University, and a BS in natural resources from Ohio State University. So I'm just going to say again, please use the Q&A to ask questions. I'll answer the ones that I can answer and leave the rest for Dr. Chambers. But I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. and turn it over to her. Thank you, Dr. Chambers, for coming today.
All right, Emily, if you can go ahead and enable sharing for me.
All right, you should have it.
Yep, there we go. All right. Let's get this in presentation mode here. How's that look, everybody? Good? Okay. Well, thank you so much, Emily, for inviting me to come speak with all of you this afternoon. I'm excited to spend an hour or 45 minutes or so with you all while you eat your lunch. To tell you a little bit about my passion, which is related to wetlands and the amazing ability they have to capture and store carbon, which is very relevant in today's world as we talk about climate change and increasing carbon in our atmosphere. Let's see here. My slides are not advancing for some reason. Let me stop sharing for just a second. Looks like my computer is somehow frozen. Of course, right? Let's give it another shot. Okay. There we go. All right. So I'm going to kind of steal Emily's idea here of going from swamp to sea. So I think that's really interesting. The St. Mary's watershed is a really unique watershed, as she told you a lot about, the uniqueness of the Okefenokee Swamp. And I also study a lot of coastal wetlands. So I'm interested in telling you about wetlands on both the Okefenokee Swamp, the kind of peat bog swamp type area you have at the headwaters, as well as going out to sea and then kind of back again. So the outline for what I'm going to talk about this afternoon is, first, I want to tell you just basically why wetlands are so good at carbon capture. When we talk about carbon, how much carbon are we really talking about, and what impact could this have for climate mitigation? What are some of the threats to wetland carbon? And then also I want to tell you about some exciting research that we're doing in our lab to look at carbon stability and kind of what properties of carbon become the most stable in wetlands. So I'm going to start with a very philosophical question for you all, and that is, what is mud? This is something that I contemplate a lot, especially when I'm out there in the wetlands covered in mud. In a most basic sense, we can think of mud as simply being a combination of soil and water. You get soil wet, you get mud, but that's not really the good mud. Okay, so to get really good, nice mud where you're sinking into your knees, you've got that swamp smell kind of permeating the air. To get that really good, high quality mud, what you really need is persistent wet conditions and lots of organic matter. And when I say organic matter, I just mean anything that either is alive currently or used to be alive. So when we talk about wetlands, there's a pretty clear scientific definition of what a wetland is. These are pictures I dug up for this presentation. I actually visited the Okefenokee Swamp. The last time I was there was in 2010. I went camping as a graduate student, and it was such an incredible experience. But Okefenokee, just like many other wetlands and the coastal wetlands that exist as well, are all characterized by three key things. And this is what defines what a wetland is. And it makes it different than a lake and different than the ocean, different than a river. They have to have persistent wet conditions that are wet enough that they actually shift the type of plants that can grow there. So we have these things called hydrophytic vegetation, and these are water-loving plants that are able to survive in the water. And so in order for you to have water plus plants growing through it, you can kind of imagine that this water level needs to be fairly shallow. And so this makes it a little bit different than a lake, where you might not see vegetation actually growing through the water like you would in a wetland. And then the other thing that's unique about wetlands is their soil. And since I have a degree in soil science, we'll be talking a lot about soil in this presentation. But the soils of wetlands are really unique, and they develop again because of that combination of water and those unique plants. So at a most basic level, why are wetlands so good at capturing carbon? Well, wetlands tend to exist in low-lying places in the landscape, whether it's right next to a river or in some kind of depression. Because they're low in the landscape, they become a natural sink. This means just based on topography, everything flows downstream. And so you're getting a combination of lots of nutrients and water and sediment from the surrounding upland that are all coming to accumulate in that wetland environment. And as a result of all of this goodness, this nutrient-rich goodness, we see lots and lots of productivity. Now, going back to intro biology, whenever plants grow, they are capturing CO2 from the atmosphere. In my intro class at UCF, I always ask them, what makes the biomass of a tree? Where does that come from? And it's always shocking to me that the majority of people say, oh, it comes from the soil. But actually, all of that plant biomass comes from the air. It comes from carbon dioxide, CO2 in our air. These plants are photosynthesizing. They're sequestering that CO2. It's reacting with water and sunlight to form organic carbon compounds. And that's what makes up all of this photosynthetic biomass in wetlands. So wetlands are producing tons and tons of biomass through this kind of sink of nutrients, fueling high rates of primary production. Now, here's the CO2 coming in, and so that's where the carbon aspect comes in. However, plants have a limited lifespan, as we know. Eventually, the plants are going to die, and they're going to start to fall to the soil surface. Now, if we look at the biomass of a plant, about 55% on average of that biomass is pure carbon from that CO2 that the plant sequestered. So we're talking about a pretty carbon-packed piece of organic matter. But what's really interesting to me is when this material dies, it starts to senesce, microbes start to take over, it starts to fall to the soil surface. And what I study, that long word biogeochemistry, is really looking at the microbial communities that naturally exist in the soil and kind of what they're doing to help cycle carbon. So if we take our little magnifying glass and we look at the soil in much greater detail, it turns out that our soils, whether they're in wetlands or not, soils everywhere are just packed with microorganisms, bacteria, archaea, protists, you name it. They are just packed with them. They've estimated that within a single gram of soil, so that's about the amount you can pinch between two fingers, there's about 40 million microbes in that single gram of soil. Whenever I present this to kids, I always tell them, okay, how long do you think it would take you to count to 40 million? That's such a huge number. And I actually calculated it, and it's 440 days to count to 40 million. That's how many microbes are in a single pinch of soil. So think how much there are in the Okefenokee swamp. It's kind of mind-blowing. But these microbes are so important to the environment and to the cycling of carbon and nutrients and everything. Because just like us, these microbes are constantly respiring. So they're taking in oxygen from the atmosphere. They're using this organic matter like dead plants and things like that as their carbon source, just like we eat food for our energy source. And then just like us, these microbes are constantly exhaling CO2 and water vapor. And so if you think about the natural cycle of carbon in the environment, in an upland ecosystem, you're going to see that the carbon balance is roughly equal. So the carbon comes in through the plants die, the microbes break it down, and it goes back out into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. So in terrestrial soils, it's a pretty much balanced system. Carbon comes in, microbes send carbon right back out. But in wetlands, well, they're wet. And so what happens is all of this water prevents the oxygen from coming in for the microbes to respire. And so all the microbes that live in wetlands are really unique, and they have to use anaerobic pathways. That means without oxygen. in order to respire. And so in order for them to break down that organic matter, they have to use strange pathways like denitrification or sulfate reduction or fermentation or methanogenesis in order to actually respire. But what this all equals into is that every time they're using these different alternative electron acceptors, the rate at which they're able to respire that carbon back into the atmosphere, it gets slower and slower and slower, and the efficiency of it gets less and less and less. And so this results in this massive accumulation of carbon in the system. So wetlands mitigate climate change because they trap all this excess carbon in the soil, because that loop is broken up by the excess water. The microbes can't respire and send it back out to the atmosphere. So we've got a system where the rate of production, or CO2 coming into the system, is immensely greater than the rate of decomposition, in which the microbes send that CO2 back out of the system. And so that's the long-winded explanation as to why wetlands store carbon. Production much greater than decomposition, and we result in this beautiful accumulation of this thick, black, carbon-rich, peaty organic soils. So how much carbon are we really talking about? So this is a chart here. This talks about fast carbon storage. Think of this like carbon that's actively cycling through the environment in the matter of a human lifespan. If we look at where the carbon is in the fast carbon pools, the atmosphere, which we talk so much about when it comes to climate change, really only encompasses about 17% of that fast carbon pool. We've got a bunch in the surface of the ocean, simply because the oceans are so huge. We've got a little bit in biomass, which is the green pie there. But about 50% of all of that carbon is stored in our soils. But the thing that always gets me is, of all of that active carbon, 16% of it is stored just in wetland soils. Now, wetlands only make up about 5% of the Earth's land surface. So we're talking about a very small area, and yet they're storing 16% of the actively cycled carbon on the whole Earth. So wetlands are really, really important to carbon burial. So I'm going to take you to a case study, and I'm going to take you to UCF. We're located on the east side of Orlando here. Many of you probably haven't been to our campus, but we have lots of natural lands around our campus. So this is kind of an aerial photograph of it. You can see all those green areas around our campus buildings. This one wetland is my favorite place on campus. It's called the Bayhead Swamp, and we've been coring the soils in this wetland for a long time. And my undergraduate student, Jennifer, here is pictured holding a soil core that's about 50 centimeters deep. So we've analyzed the soil core, and in this soil core, there's about 80% water, because we know the system's flooded, and about 20% solids. Of those solids, about 86% of it is pure organic matter. And again, roughly 55% of that pure organic matter is just carbon. So if we were to calculate that out, in this one little soil core, we've got about 250 grams of carbon, which actually equates to about 18 pounds of CO2, just in that one little soil core. And what's really interesting is this particular swamp on our campus is really deep. So it extends down about 5 meters, which, to put into perspective, that's about almost 16.5 feet of just pure dense peat. And what I want to show you here in this image is that the soil carbon density actually increases as you go down. So the deeper you get, the more densely packed the carbon is on a concentration, a gram per kilogram of soil concentration. So it gets older as you go down, and it gets denser and denser. And in just a minute, I'm going to pass this back to Emily so she can talk to you a little bit about the storage in the Okefenokee Swamp. But it has a similar really deep deposit of this carbon-rich peat soils up to 15 feet. But going back to UCF real quick, this whole area, this natural area, we call it an urban green space because our campus is pretty much surrounded by development. It's a little less than 1 square mile. And what we've calculated is this one little area stores 85,482 megagrams of soil carbon. And this number, again, hard to put your head around, it's equivalent to removing 68,200 US passenger cars from the road for an entire year. So that's just in this little oasis of green space within the UCF campus. But Emily, if you want to take it back and tell them a little bit about the Okefenokee.
Yeah, so it's a lot bigger of a space. So you can imagine that the carbon sequestration is much larger. So again, the Okefenokee swamp is around 438,000 acres. And the peat bogs, the Okefenokee's peatland, is the largest remaining undisturbed peat deposit within the northern hemisphere's subtropical zone from around the globe. So it's got a big impact in its carbon sequestration. So the Okefenokee peat bogs store enough carbon to equal over 95 million tons of carbon dioxide. There is also peat on the surrounding areas as well. So along Trail Ridge, there are also peat beds that also store carbon. Just to put this into perspective, like Dr. Chambers did, the peat within the Okefenokee swamp stores the equivalent to the carbon dioxide emissions of 2 million cars driving for 9.4 years. So it is quite a place to be with your carbon atom.
Awesome. Those are such cool statistics. Thank you. Yeah, so as you can see, these wetlands are really important, and the bigger the wetland, the bigger the impact. All right, so one more kind of visual to help you understand, how important this carbon storage is, and specifically how important the water is. So remember that the water is what prevents the microbes from respiring that carbon back into the atmosphere. And in order to put this into a visual, I think the best place to look is the Everglades agricultural area. So if you're familiar at all with Florida, we're talking about kind of the southern central part of Florida. This is the headwaters to the Everglades. Just south of Lake Okeechobee, you can see in that aerial all those weird blocks. That's agricultural land. So what they did was they took part of the Everglades that was really rich in peat and they drained it. This was, over a century ago for agriculture. And ever since they did that, this huge peat deposit has slowly been respired by microbes. We call this oxidation because they're getting oxygen where they didn't used to get oxygen. But here are some really, I think, startling pictures of what's happened there in the Everglades agricultural area. So the one picture on the left side of your screen is a subsidence post that somebody had the foresight to actually bang this thing down to the bedrock when they first started draining the Everglades agricultural area. And so the top of that post was even with the soil surface in 1927. And they've been watching it become more and more and more exposed over time as all of that soil that's super rich in carbon is slowly being respired by those microbes. And it's simply going up into the atmosphere. It's literally disappearing. So on the bottom picture, you can see 1968, this is a really famous soil scientist that went to take a look at it. And then I had the privilege of going there in 2010, and I got to stand next to it too, which was a proud moment for any soil scientist. But you can see how much it's increased since then. And then the other picture I love is on the bottom here. So this home, when built, sat on the soil surface. They did not have any stairs up to their front door. And this box that you see on the side there is actually their septic system, which of course was originally buried below the ground, but is now completely exposed because all the soil is gone. So this is what happens when you drop the water table. That carbon in the soil is very vulnerable. And those microbes, as soon as they get oxygen, they are going for it. Their populations boom, and they are just respiring and getting all that carbon out of the soil. So let's move for a moment to the coast, because the St. Mary's is really unique because it goes from the Okefenokee all the way into the coastal marshes. And a lot of scientists refer to these coastal ecosystems as blue carbon ecosystems. A blue carbon ecosystem is a vegetated coastal ecosystem, whether it's a salt marsh or a mangrove swamp or a seagrass bed. But they started to call them blue carbon because they wanted to bring attention to the fact that these vegetated coastal ecosystems store huge amounts of carbon. Many people, when they think about carbon capture, they might picture a rainforest or something like that. But it turns out blue carbon systems are actually burying carbon more efficiently than many forests. So this is a famous paper that came out in 2012 or 2011, looking at carbon burial rates per meter squared per year. And you can start to see tropical rainforest, boreal and temperate forest relative to our blue carbon ecosystems, our salt marshes, our mangroves, and our seagrass beds. So you can see how much higher the rate of burial is. And again, this has to do with the fact that the soils are wet. So high productivity combined with wet conditions means that that carbon is going to get buried, and it gets buried in the soil for the most part. Now, in these coastal ecosystems, a lot of the concern is related to rising sea levels. We're seeing sea level rise at a rate a little over 3 millimeters per year currently. And there's been a lot of talk among scientists about what's going to happen to these vast areas of coastal wetlands that are storing so much of our carbon. There's a couple different things that we know can happen to coastal wetlands as sea level rises. One is that they simply move inland. So this image here is from the Everglades. And what you can see is kind of these weird plant zonations that are based on salinity and water level tolerance. So if you've got a big flat area and you've got plenty of space, these ecosystems will kind of just move upslope and kind of remain intact. That's definitely a great response for nature. Sometimes they're actually able to just build soil faster. So they're actually vertically accreting. More and more of that organic matter is getting deposited on the surface, and it's actually building vertical elevation of the soil. And this works really well, in low disturbance systems with lots of sediment and big tidal ranges to bring in a bunch of nutrients. And then the least desirable, of course, is submergence. So oftentimes what we see is this seaward submergence, where the edge of the wetland gets falls off into the ocean, maybe with a little bit of landward migration on the other side. But a lot of it depends on the health of the ecosystem and the shape of the land. So is there room for it to migrate upslope? Is there time for plants to reestablish upslope? If there's development there blocking the way, that becomes an issue. We call that coastal squeeze. I want to tell you a little bit about a project that I've been working on a lot lately. This is in coastal Louisiana, and we were asking the question as it relates to soil carbon. What happens when these coastal marshes fall into the ocean? So in coastal Louisiana, they're seeing accelerated rates of sea level because they've got land subsidence in combination with rising sea levels. And so a lot of this organic matter and this organic rich soil is falling off into the ocean. It's eroding away, like you can kind of see in this image here. And we wanted to understand what happens to it. When it falls into the ocean, does it just get buried in the ocean? Or do those microbes go to work like we talked about and start respiring it? So we did a bunch of research down there, and just to move straight into the results, what we found was that unfortunately it looked like most of that soil carbon, once it submerged into the ocean as a result of these accelerated sea level rise rates, were converted right back to CO2. Now this means that either that CO2 is going straight into the atmosphere, or because it's an oceanic system, it can also become dissolved in the water itself and contribute to ocean acidification. The other thing that we studied a lot was not just the carbon, but also all of the other nutrients that were contained within those soils. So the nitrogen and the phosphorus. You may have heard about nitrogen and phosphorus because they're major contributors to things like harmful algal blooms. When that carbon is released through the microbes, all of that nitrogen and phosphorus gets released as well. So we might have some water quality issues that result. But I want you to look at this aerial. This is actually one of our sites that we studied in Louisiana, and we watched this little marsh island disappear over the course of our 3-year study. So if you look at these little things sticking out of the water, those were actually PVC poles we used to mark the edge of the marsh. So when we first started this project, those outermost poles were the edge of the marsh, and we were actually able to monitor as that marsh just slowly eroded away into the bay. And we found that it eroded at an average rate of 1.4 meters per year. And you can see how dramatic that was. And also that about 150 centimeters of the soil profile eroded with each step. So we're talking about a pretty thick piece of organic rich soil. That bottom of that 150 centimeter section of soil was dated to be about 850 years old. So we're losing, 850 years worth of accumulated carbon through the erosion of this marsh. And the last thing I wanted to talk to you a little bit about is this is kind of a new area of research that my lab has been focusing on a lot, is that when carbon gets trapped and buried in the soil, depending on how it's interacting with the soil can influence how stable it is when conditions might change. So if you think about it on a most basic level, we can think about soils as either being really mineral based. So this is like inorganic materials like sands and silts and clays. This picture here is from a very, very clay rich soil, as you can see how it just holds together. And then other soils are completely composed of almost nothing but organic matter. We call these peat or organic based soils. So if we're to look at these two together, what we found through a bunch of our research is that associations with minerals, specifically really fine silts and clays, helps to protect that organic matter. So if you look at this image here, this kind of schematic, you can see the organic matter in the center, and then you can see how there's clay particles and quartz and different types of things that surround it. So it turns out that these minerals are really important to kind of protecting that organic matter in the soil. And they've shown that when it's associated with silts and clays, it can be preserved for centuries to millennia. And it's a lot less vulnerable to oxidation, even if conditions change, like a wetland gets drained or something like that. So this is kind of interesting new stuff that we're working on. What we've basically found is that these mineral-based soils, although they have less total carbon, if you were just to count how much carbon's in there, the carbon tends to be a lot more stable because of its association with minerals, whereas this peat-based soil has tons of carbon, but it's very vulnerable. So think back to Everglades agricultural area. That was all this peat organic based soils. And we saw in those images how rapidly it oxidized as a result of that drop in water table. So organic soils tend to be a lot more vulnerable than more mineral based soils. So finally, I'm going to end with what you can do, because everybody wants to know, how can we help to preserve all of this great carbon that wetlands are naturally accumulating and storing for us in the ecosystem. And at the most basic level, really the most important things you can do is to keep it wet. Again, as soon as that water table drops, those microbes are going to go to work. So keeping that water table up, and then also giving it space. Nature has a really amazing ability to adapt to changing conditions. The earth has always been really dynamic. So having hands off and letting the ecosystems be able to adjust and acclimate to shifting conditions on their own is usually the most successful outcome. So with that, I will go ahead and take any questions.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Chambers. So please use the Q&A feature for your questions. Two things that I just want to mention while the Q&As are coming in. One interesting thing was your comparison with the swamp to the estuaries. So the St. Mary's River is almost privately owned all the way down. There's actually only one city on the main stem of St. Mary's, which is the city of St. Mary's. But if you can go for miles without seeing a single home, a single person, so most of the land use in the area is timber plantations and blueberry farms for the buffer for the swamp, but it's also mostly timber plantations along the main stem of the St. Mary's River. So between like the swamp, the landowners along the main stem itself, and then once you get out into the wetlands, when the salinity starts to increase to get to that brackish water, there's a lot of carbon storage potential just within the St. Mary's River watershed. Which is pretty astounding. I hadn't thought about all of the additional carbon that could be stored near the mouth of the river as well.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that I noticed was that the swamp is peat based, obviously. But when you were talking about silts and sands for the mineral based, I mean, that's what it's a heavy mineral mine. So they're going after only about 2% of what they're really mining for, what they're digging up in their 50-foot deep hole. They're only trying to extract about 2% of it. So Trail Ridge is that mineral based storage for the carbon. So it doesn't store as much, but it's more efficient in its storage, which is pretty impressive. So we have two very impressive bases to be able to store the carbon in two entirely different ways, which is pretty impressive.
Yeah.
Oh, well, Sam, we had a question. Are the Trail Ridge soils more organic or more mineral based? So hopefully that answered your question, Sam. That Trail Ridge seems to be more mineral based since it is a heavy mineral mine rather than the peat based. But there is peat in the wetlands on Trail Ridge. So there are wetlands there that will be mined through this mining project. It's a great question. Any other questions, please go ahead and feel free to put it in the chat. So while people are still thinking, Dr. Chambers, your research in Louisiana, was it sea level rise or was it just the motion of the water that was kind of eroding away? That it was just one section, it looked like, or at least one section that y'all were tracking. Did you see it throughout the rest of the island or just that section?
Yeah, no, it's happening all over. You know, Louisiana has one of the highest, if not the highest rate of land loss in the whole world. They went through a period of time where they were losing, they've lost over the area of the state of Rhode Island, you know, over the past several years. And it's unique because it's the Mississippi River Delta. So like I mentioned, the land is sinking while sea levels are rising. So on average, global ocean levels are increasing at a rate about 3.2 millimeters per year. In Louisiana, it's more like 10 millimeters per year because of that sinking plus sea level rise. And so things are eroding like very rapidly. And that site that we were looking at, yeah, we saw entire islands disappear while we were doing the study. It was eroding on all sides, but a lot of it is this edge erosion. So it's driven by winds and they're kind of lapping up against these marshes and just washing it away. But I think the sea level rise puts it at just that perfect position where it's going to eat away at the soils and cause them to collapse.
Do you see any positive results of doing like these living shoreline projects with preventing vegetation from receding as the waters are starting to come in, and erosion prevention?
Yeah, you know, I haven't done any living shoreline work in Louisiana, but I do a lot in Florida. And there's definitely a good potential for those kinds of natural solutions. If you get in there early before things become too severe, because the root structure is really what holds the soil together, especially when you have organic soils. So anything that you can do to increase the root biomass in the soil to kind of hold that soil and prevent erosion is really helpful. And interestingly, some of the work we're doing in Florida is showing that mangroves are encroaching further poleward now as a result of warming. And the mangroves are really good at holding the soil together and resisting that edge erosion too.
Great. So we had a couple of questions come in. We have, when developers fill in wetlands, are they ultimately releasing carbon to the atmosphere? And then does the fill area sink some dimension over time?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So when wetlands are just filled, like if you took a peat deposit and just covered it up, you are going to get some slow oxidation with that. If it's drained and covered over, depending on how they do it and how they fill it in, is going to depend on how much oxygen gets to those microbes, right? If there's a huge soil cap on, it's not going to happen very rapidly, but you are probably still going to get some activity. Microbes are so resilient and they can live anywhere and everywhere and eat anything and everything. So yeah, you would probably see, if they didn't do it properly or didn't use the right materials, you would probably see a little bit of sinking over time.
Great. And the next question we had was, what is the impact to the ocean from the additional carbon from the soil?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So when the carbon erodes, one thing that might happen is it can actually serve as a food source for some organisms that live in the ocean. But what most likely happens to a lot of it is that the microbes in the ocean start to respire it. Just like the microbes live in the soil, there's a big consortia of microbes that live in the ocean. And so they break it down and exhale it as CO2. Some of that CO2 might just go straight back into the atmosphere, but a lot of it is trapped in the water. And what happens with that CO2 is it interacts with water to form carbonic acid. And we've heard about ocean acidification and how the pH of the ocean is decreasing. So it kind of contributes to that whole process of ocean acidification, because it's pumping more and more of that CO2 into the water column is what we think is happening to most of it, because we don't see it in the sediment. If we were kind of hoping that it would just collapse into the bay and then maybe kind of get captured in the ocean sediments, but we cored tons of ocean sediments and there's really no evidence of it anywhere.
Wow. Has there been, I guess, how is the carbon stored from wetlands brought into, because it's such a big piece of the pie, how is that taken into consideration for like climate change and reclamation projects for trying to restore wetlands? I know that they're trying to restore the Everglades from the drainage, and it's, that plan is potentially going to be over $23 million of a project to have to do, and it's probably still not going to do the job that it was doing naturally. Yeah. So I guess, how is it included in the climate change plan for carbon?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's necessarily any official government plan about wetlands. We've been trying to preserve wetlands since the 1970s and the passage of the Clean Water Act and the inclusion of wetlands as waters of the United States. So we've recognized the importance of wetlands for many decades now. At first, it was because they were good bird habitat and hunters started to notice waterfowl populations decline. Then we started to notice it as a result of water quality, because one thing I didn't touch on at all is that wetlands are our filters. There are natural kidneys of the landscape that filter out a bunch of pollutants. But now I think a lot of the focus is on carbon. And so that's why that blue carbon term, that kind of cute term that they use to describe these coastal ecosystems, has become popular, because there are a lot of people advocating to preserve wetlands solely for their function as a carbon resource. One of the biggest things people talk about with wetlands and climate change is the boreal peatlands. There's huge areas of peatlands throughout Canada, Alaska, Siberia, that have so much carbon stored in them from, centuries, millennia. And as they thaw, again, that's captured not just because of wet conditions, but also because of cold conditions. So the microbes, as they warm up and they get oxygen, they're going crazy up there and respiring that carbon into the atmosphere.
A unique thing about the Okefenokee Swamp as a wetland is that it is a headwaters to two rivers. And usually wetlands are in a freshwater system closer to the ocean or a mouth of a waterway. So I guess, can you talked a little bit about water quality, but what's the role of a wetland in the health of a downstream water body, whether it's a tributary or a main stem like we find in the St. Mary's River?
Yeah, so wetlands, like I said, we always call them the kidneys of the landscape because they're great filters. Because they're sinks, for one thing, everything just kind of sits there. So a lot of times pollutants, suspended solids will just simply settle out and get buried in the sediment. All those plants can take up excess nutrients. And then going back to all those microbes, we talked about how they can use different pathways to respire, but this is why wetlands are used almost like bioremediation, is because the microbes are so diverse and their ability to use all kinds of different compounds is so extensive that they can break up and break down a lot of pollutants. Like nitrogen, they're really efficient at processing, denitrifying nitrogen pollution and releasing it back as just harmless N2 gas. But they found that microbes can break down all kinds of things. There are studies that look at microbes remediating jet fuel and stuff like that, because even petroleum products are carbon based. And so there's microbes that have evolved to be able to utilize that as their food source. So the Okefenokee is a great resource as this super large natural filtration system that anything that comes in there is going to get out a lot of the pollutants before it moves downstream.
Yeah, and the pH really helps a lot too. So naturally the pH of the St. Mary's River in the upper section as it exits the swamp can be as low as 3, which
Wow.
would put it on any impairment list for a water body. But in that area, it's natural to be that low because of the amount of peat, the tannins, all that kind of stuff. It's a natural black water system, which kind of helps it. We don't have the algae bloom issues in the St. Mary's River as you would find in some of the other Florida water bodies because of that natural pH. But I do like the analogy of like the kidneys of our waterways. So it being at the headwaters really does start us out at being pristine of a water body, which is great.
Yeah.
Well, I have not seen any more questions in the Q&A. So if anybody has questions after this, I know this was a lot of information. That's why we're doing these webinars, is to share everything that we can of value for the St. Mary's River watershed, which includes the Okefenokee Swamp as our headwaters. So I just wanted to share this last slide before we say goodbye to our guest speaker here, is ways to engage. So these are, a lot of people are asking like, well, what can we do? So these are some things that you can do today. So St. Mary's Riverkeeper is an environmental advocacy group. So we get people to engage in any which way that they are able to, whether it's getting them on the water or activating them to say something to their local officials. So I'm an educator by trade, so I like to do these educational events opportunities. So you can join us on any of our future ones, become a member. We are a membership-based donation organization. And our next For Our River episode 3 is on March 8th. Again, it's about the Florida and aquifer, so the water under our feet and kind of how we're all connected by the groundwater, and how water withdrawals can possibly impact surface water flows. So that is going to be next Wednesday, March 8th at noon. Please register. You can register on the same page of our website like you did for this one. You can file public comment expressing your concerns regarding the mine, specifically talking about the mining land use plan. Urge your elected officials at the city level, the county level to also file public comment. These public comments are questions that you have regarding the permit that aren't clear. You just aren't sure why they are the way that they are. And so they will answer them for you. Either the state will or the mining company will. Encourage your Congress members to urge the U.S. Department of Interior to list the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge as a candidate for designation as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So it has been on the list for quite some time, but as currently in the past couple of years has been gaining traction. And so you can go to you can Google Okefenokee World Heritage Site, and there's a website you can go to, learn all about it, support it, write a letter to the U.S. Department of Interior to help this process along. It is a lengthy process, but there's a great team of people that are leading the charge on it. So the St. Mary's River is bookended by two national treasures, the Okefenokee Swamp, potential World Heritage Site, and then we have at our mouth the Cumberland Island National Seashore, which is a designated wilderness area. And in between is our beautiful, pristine St. Mary's River. So thank you so much, Dr. Oh, I think we had one more. How does Okefenokee qualify as a World Heritage Site? I am not the expert on that. I am just encouraging you to go and to learn about it. So just go to that. I can't remember the exact address for it, but if you just Google Okefenokee World Heritage Site, there's a whole website where you can learn all about what's going on with that. So thank you so much for participating. Thank you, Dr. Chambers. And we will be uploading this recording as soon as I can figure out how to do it. So hopefully in the next day or two, but please register for our next webinar next Wednesday, March 8th. Thank you all so much and enjoy the rest of your day.